find that like when you go and you visit certain sacred sites or important places that it does a little something for you that just reading about things can't do?
Oh, for sure, for sure. In fact, I just said in passing, it's a little bit like being inside of a mandala, right? And the really powerful Buddhist experience of that I've had was at Borobudur in Java, in Indonesia. I don't know if you're familiar with that site, but oh my God, well, it's based on the Avatamsaka Sutra, and it's this enormous sort of stupa with hundreds, at least hundreds of Buddhas inside there, each in their own little. It's made of stone, inside their own stupas, which have these sort of cutaways so you can see inside them. Some of them have been removed. And Java was part of a Buddhist kingdom 1,000 or so years ago, right? It's similar to the ones in Bagan in northern Myanmar, which also is another one. I would name those two as the most sort of powerful physical experiences of Buddhist sites I've ever been in. Because you walk along it has these concentric ascending rings. Also, the huge, one more, the third one is the huge stupa that's sort of in the center of Yangon, in Burma, in Myanmar, which is it's totally immersed. It's full of people, it's full of life, but and it's these ascending layers, and at every site there's a Buddha image, or actually around the base at Borobudur, I think there's the Sudana story from the Avatamsaka, who, visiting the 53 bodhisattvas, and you can circumambulate, as you find done in many Buddhist sutras, following each of those stories, if you're familiar with them, but they have a little inscription or something, a little illustration, and then you ascend and you get to the Buddhas, this sort of multitude of Buddhas. So that was a really powerful place. The other one is Bagan in northern Myanmar. I would recommend, and if you ever get a chance, to go there, because it was part of that same Mahayana Buddhist kingdom, and there are thousands of these temples and shrines there. They were been abandoned. They were kind of literally just left there and rediscovered in the last century. It's just part of the countryside. But a lot of them are in very good shape, and they're beautiful architectural sites. And as far as the eye can see in every direction, particularly Guanyin Avalokiteshvara as a kind of patron bodhisattva of that particular kingdom. So there's some amazing sculpture and structures, and you're just in this, Pure Land. You're in this Buddha field, and you can wander in any direction. It's pretty. If you have Buddhist sentiments, you will be quite moved, I think, there.
Yeah, yeah, and especially that kind of quality where some of the earth has kind of reclaimed some of it, I'm
Yeah,
sure, and there's this kind of woven nature to it.
yeah, exactly. The sort of, the history and even the kind of abandonment of it adds that feeling of persistence yet impermanence. That's
Yeah.
very striking. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then just curious about your experience, like participating in that mandala um, experience where you're walking it, and so someone coming from someone that has these feelings toward like maybe these affections for Buddhism, and then there's also the scholarship that you have, and maybe in the practice. But when you go there and you're visiting a site like that, or a sacred space, and
Yeah.
you're participating in those circumambulation circambulation. What am I trying to say?
Triangulation, just walking
Okay,
around.
cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
walking around. Yeah, got a little too fancy for myself. Almost fell. The when you walk around that and you are kind of participating, getting closer and closer into those inner
Yeah.
spaces as you also ascend too. Does it? I'm sure there's the historical significances of it, and you see the stories being told. But did you feel anything as you were kind of moving through it that felt particularly interesting?
Yeah, I am susceptible to that in sort of Buddhist sites and to Buddhist iconography. The other one would be Dunhuang in China, which all those caves and the cave paintings of scenes from Mahayana Sutras. So yeah, I'm quite affected by those, to see those in concrete, lived, that the kind of traces of meditators, right? Practitioners and devotees and people who were really thinking about those same sort of texts, sutras, scriptures that I spend a lot of time thinking about. The caves in Dunhuang were a meditation site, supposedly, and also a great art sort of artifact, incredible paintings, wall paintings in there. So I always, because yeah, I do a lot of my Buddhism is a private and intellectual endeavor, right? Where I'm working, looking at text and thinking about text, but my surroundings have nothing to do with. I mean, although I like to keep sort of Buddhist stuff around me in the home, but I mean, we don't live in that world. We live in a world that has different sort of cultural priorities, right? So I'm always quite moved and affected, and I will, often maybe recite a sutra or meditate, or just linger in those sorts of sites. I really like them. I really like going to them.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
that. Well, that's wonderful that you also bring something to it where you don't just participate in the viewing or the circumambulations. There it is. Oh boy, that took me a second. But you also like will recite a sutra or take a moment to recognize it or to implement some element of practice into that space that you're in, which is really
Yes.
wonderful. And then for your because I understand that you're balancing both a scholarship and a practice element. I was wondering, um, how does that go for you? I mean, like, do they
Yeah.
both kind of feed each other, or do you feel like, oh, I have to keep something separate here in order to be a professional, but also have to keep this practice element pure? I was wondering what that feels like for you.
No, and I know, and I wanted to talk about this with you in particular because, yeah, the practice side is, kind of a peculiar aspect of this. And I'll just tell you my history with that. Maybe is a good way to get into that. I have occasionally participated in sort of formal meditation group settings. In Taiwan, I would sometimes do a retreat or something like that. Pretty minor if you look at like serious practitioners. In Thailand once or twice, but not in many, many years. And those were kind of a dipping my foot in, and just that was, and you could even read them as almost research activities in a way, field research. But I really, really liked it and was kind of terrified by the intensity of it in a way. So my sort of Buddhist practice, such as it is, I mean, on the one hand, a lot of the research I do, and I wrote this to you yesterday. I mean, the one thing I've been really preoccupied with in the last decade or so is working with the ancient Tiantai meditation texts. So, Tiantai is this tradition that I focus on, this Chinese Buddhist tradition, has a very intricate doctrinal, philosophical, exegetical, hermeneutic kind of structure that takes a lot of time and a lot of, effort and a lot of reading to sort of get a handle on. So, that my philosophical interests initially were focused on just sort of figuring out how the system worked. But the other interesting thing about Tiantai, maybe in some contrast to some of the other Chinese schools like Huayan, even Chan, right? I mean, famously, Chan is the meditation school, but you don't really have intricate descriptions of meditative experience or instruction manuals or techniques or, sort of roadmap stuff in Chan. It's one of the things it deliberately avoids. So, but you do have those in Tiantai. In fact, one of the greatest works of Tiantai is a, 1,000-page, well, in English it's three, I think it's Paul Swanson just put out a translation of it, the Mohojer Guan, in Japanese Makashikan, 3,000 pages in English or something. It's enormous, right? And it's just a meditation text, okay? Of course, it has interwoven all this special Tiantai philosophical material, but of course, it really is all about the invoking and working with present, real-time, experiential digestion and realization of the philosophical stuff. So on the one hand, it's not much practiced anymore, in communal settings. I mean, I think Mount Hiei in Japan is a Tendai center, and they do some of the things, but there's so much, and it's so intricate. So my point just being, I'm spending a lot of time on meditation materials. It's not completely separate in Tentai from the philosophical materials, but it really is about actual meditation practice. And I want to reconstruct how those worked and how they work together. And part of that, again, is me having to try them out. I have to try to work through them. So I have a little bit of that ulterior motive, but actually the scholarship has an ulterior motive, which is I really, in an existential way, I care about that. And that is, a huge part of, my day-to-day life is trying to, in a formal way, as set down in Tentai texts, which include ritual, devotional, and sort of formal meditation steps, but also a lot of sort of special Tiantai mental tricks. I haven't done the time I did the most formal meditation of the kind you would probably do in Soto Zen, and I occasionally, I told you I go to Dan and Taigen Lighten's center, and sometimes I would give a talk there, and I would sit with them, and I always found that a great experience, right? I'm just too, I don't know, whatever, not a good community joiner or something, that I wouldn't keep up a thing like that. But all my experiences with that in formal setting have been very positive, and they've always been kind of eye-opening to me, and things I would bring, into my daily life. But I tend to be a solitary pratyeka Buddha kind of person, and but like during COVID, for example, when we were really in lockdown for whatever that year was, that was the time I did a lot of formal meditation sitting, right, for a period of time at the same time every day, and really worked out a kind of regimen that was, it was one of the great benefits of COVID for me. Because I would never do it otherwise. I had all day in my home to kill, and it became a hugely important structuring element there. And I made a lot of advances. They feed each other, because like I can't understand these things in purely dry way intellectually. Sometimes I really have to go under the hood and do them.
Yeah. And then you have that perspective of like having really lived it, and you can share, like you can bring like some of those elements of a 3,000 page text, and bring a little bit of like personal experience, personal touch, and be like, well, I know this feels a little dry here, but I can actually speak to what this does.
Totally. And I mean, with the Tiantai texts, it's especially a big problem because they're very dry. I mean, you try to read, and they're totally confusing, and like they're not very reader friendly at all. Even for a philosopher who's just interested in the ideas, you know, you're going to get lost in this maze of categories and subcategories. But actually, Jiri, the founder of Tiantai, who wrote or lectured that text, he says, I'm trying to describe my meditative experience. And Jiri even says, and, if I happen to luckily find something in the scriptures, he used that term luckily, by chance, that corroborates it, then I put in that citation. But this is really me trying, in this incredibly intricate, roundabout way, to describe my own meditation practice. So, indeed it is true. There are many things that, like, when you try to reassemble all the pieces that are left as sort of traces of that sort of secondary derivative attempt, and put them together, tinker toy them, you get this Rube Goldberg device that sounds incredibly complicated, and like what? Why would you go there from there? But if you're moving from the inside out, like, well, this is just the way this, a struggle to express this, that has to separate all these different moving parts, comes across. But there's the key thing that's going on there. And once you have any sense of that, that's really, to me, that's the only way you can make sense, even philosophically, of what's going on. And then you can reconstruct, So to
Yeah.
me, it's really essential. And that's what Tiantai claims too. They say doctrine and practice have to go hand in hand, like two wings of a bird. They can't really, neither one make any sense without the other.
I appreciate many of the qualities of many of the aspects of what you're saying, because there's that lived experience thing where you can bring your own perspective into the lifting out that dryness and making it a little more accessible to people, but also too, the lengths at which Jury kind of explained the meditative process for him. And also too, I appreciate you mentioning that there's this like, well, luckily, hopefully I can find some precedent in here, but this is what I got. This is the best that I can do. But it kind of like, it brings a little humility to it. But with the article that you sent to me from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that kind of breaks down a lot of Tiantai history, but also like some of the praxis, some of the approaches to this meditation training. There's this wonderful example about um, kind of comprehending and accessing a mug of coffee, and you're looking at the different thought um, expressions that are happening as you are handling that, or like as a concept, as the cup of coffee is, and also what you are not thinking about too, like what
Yeah,
it isn't also isn't, and how all of that has to happen at the same time
yeah,
for the moment to happen, because the moment it comprehends or is uh involves every single component of it and all the things that it is not. And I just love that you can bring that into a very approachable sense, for at least for myself. And I was wondering, like, what I mean, do you sometimes try to bring that to some of your mindful, like, do you try to bring a mindful
yeah.
approach like that to your coffee or your
Oh
meals or
yeah.
something?
Oh, big time. Yeah. I mean, that's the main thing that I try, that floats my boat, really. I mean, as I'm going through the day, there's a lot of time when you know, I mean, there's nothing I like more than that, I would say, but as I say, rarely am I sitting and doing that, but I am drinking a cup of coffee, I'm waiting for the bus, or I'm driving my car, and there's all kinds of things that are applicable there, and constantly applying that, because the whole point, as you know, in Buddhist practice, I mean, it is meant to be applicable to every single moment of experience, anything you are experiencing. Mindfulness is one piece of that, is one dimension of that, right? An essential dimension of that, and Tiantai builds on that in certain ways, right? It's mindfulness sort of pointed in a particular direction, tweaked in a certain way. But yeah, there can't be any moment of anything that's an exception to what they're talking about, right? So yeah, and I mean, well, there's two things to say about a coffee cup, right? On the one hand, it's an everyday experience, and so if I'm writing and I'm thinking and I'm trying to say that, I'm looking around and I'm trying to ground this some way that I can, you know, kind of triangulate the point in a way that will bring all the pieces together. But there's another part of that, and this sort of also relevant to what I was saying about, how complicated the Tiantai texts are, is that it's a teaching thing, So, I mean, I've been teaching this stuff to undergraduates and graduate students for 30 years or something now, long, terribly long time. And so often, of course, you're doing that to yourself too, right? You talk to yourself, like, what do you mean by that? What are you talking about? Like, what about with this, right? And you have to explain it. But of course, if you do have to do that to a class of students, you really have to find something right there that you can glom onto. And the coffee cup tends to be the go-to example because it's always like in my hand, as I'm talking. So I just want to say an entity, some entity, name it, right? But it usually ends up being the coffee cup.
And I meant to bring this up a little bit later on, but there's the book cover for your one of your latest publications, Experiments in Mystical Atheism, has Godless Epiphanies from Daoism to Spinoza and Beyond, has a coffee mug that's being
Yeah.
blown to bits. It looks like, so it's always at hand. Yeah.
That's right. I think that's actually a teapot.
Oh, excuse me.
In that
Sorry.
case, and that there is an incident in the book that tries to do, but it is exactly that. It's like, okay, I've been getting through all this kind of abstract, highfalutin, metaphysical talk. Now let's take it down, okay? And it was actually, I'll give you a little scoop on that, actually, because That thing in the book, which I'll tell you about in a second, actually happened, which was I was actually making a pot of tea, and there was a knock on the door, and it was my neighbor with his daughter. He's like a divorced dad, and his daughter's over on the weekend, and they had the father-daughter project or something. They had made cookies, and the idea was to distribute them to neighbors. So, but because I was like surprised and interrupted, I knocked over my tea kettle, and it exploded all over the floor. So, and I'm slightly cut my foot, rushed to the door. I'm not completely dressed, and I have this sort of social interaction I have to deal with. I don't actually want these cookies. It was like, it was just a moment of there's nothing planned or organized or, according to any intention. There's so many things going on here. I just want that moment when the teapot hit the ground. I'm like halfway leaning. It's like we were saying before. You think about how you would have to explain the intricacy of all those elements, right? They're all part of one moment, right? All those things, and you may try to organize them in various ways according to laws or according to purposes or according to narratives, but they're all locked together in that moment, right? All those conflicting emotions and torques of action, and I just wanted to get. So they say when they were producing that book, it was like, "What do you want for the cover?" And I was like, "I don't have any. I don't know. And I want a picture of somebody." But I just thought one idea would be just a shattering teapot. And they sent me proof, like five different versions, right? Like it's almost just expanding, and like they did some kind of slow motion photography. They had to do it in real time. I mean, but I like it. It came out pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly did. I mean, it's very provocative. Like you kind of like are drawn to this kind of like shattered image with some of the liquid kind of spilling out,
Yeah.
and to now have that story behind it too. I mean, like that is I just got like very tense just just hearing about
Yeah.
like that moment because like I think it's very relatable too because it's just like one after the other. You feel like you're in a Meet the Parents or something like that. There's just like
Yeah.
one thing keeps happening and this
That's
happens
right.
over there.
That's right.
Um,
And to your point before about the coffee cup, the whole point is if it's not a moment like that, right, where it's so complex and so uneasy and so off balance, and, you know, but that is a full member of the universe, that moment, right? That is a voting member, and in Tiantai terms, that is the absolute itself. So, right, I mean, you want to catch that moment in its fullness in some way, because that's the kind of moment that you're normally going to sort of absorb into another piece of another story, right? Oh, I got to clean it up now. Okay, what was I doing? What was my day? I was going to be writing this chapter of this book. Now I have to, you can't, right? There's all to be able to notice that exact instant, right? When things are spinning out of control as you know, um, its own Buddha nature, if you like, is sort of what I'm getting at there.
Yeah. Well, and I suppose that it doesn't always have to be chaotic moments too. I mean, it could be this very moment, right?
Yeah,
There's nothing being smashed in my vicinity right now, but like there is this moment that's being born and
yeah,
expanding in its own way.
exactly. Any ordinary moment, I mean, in a way, even a more boring moment is even more challenging in a way, right? Because you don't even notice it's there, right?
Yeah.
Right. But the problem is it's hard to put that on a book cover. But maybe you could, right? I mean, that would be just a placid, maybe picture of just an ordinary, field of grass or something that nothing is happening in, right? That
Yeah.
would,
Well, and so I'm just curious for you. I mean, it sounds like you're very committed to investigating the fullness of these moments, like the dust and the finitude and the maybe some of the more complex, like less romantic ideas about what the moment can
yeah,
encompass, and but for myself included at times, like I'll find that like I want to have an idealized or romanticized version of a mindful moment where I'm to have a mindful moment means that I have to go and sit on a cushion
yeah,
in a retreat space and have certain conditions perfectly met, the sun just so, and all this different stuff, and having eaten all these wonderful things to have got me in balance. And um And it seems like for you, like the that practice can begin in the morning when you're groggy, getting up and trying to like get clothes on, feed the cats or whatever it is. Like all of those also count as that as moments to be mindful of, or to allow to be in its fullness. Uh, how do you help people access that?
Yeah,
Because it's a hard sell.
yeah, I know. But let me say about that. I mean, this is another thing that I like about these Tiantai meditation texts because they're extremely concrete, right? And I mean, the whole idea is there. Of course, there are conditions, right? There's got to be conditions, and for most of the time and for most people, it's very important to try to, if you can, if there's an opportunity to do so, to set up those conditions, right there. I mean, we don't need to get into the weeds of why, there's so much attention to that actually in Tentai text. They don't want to say the unconditioned is just there. There are some reads of Buddha nature that are like that, but that's one thing you may know from that article I sent you, that they're not, on the contrary, it's always conditional. It's always conditioned. There's no escaping conditionality. So that means it's not only legitimate, it's super important to try to figure out what are the conditions that are most conducive, right? That's the whole game in a way, right? And in a vast majority of cases, it probably is going to be okay. You want to be relatively, you don't want to be too hungry or too full. You want to be relatively comfortable, but not blah, right? And there's a ton of attention to that, and I think it's super important, very helpful. But the great thing also that I love about those manuals is Jury is always the reason he's not that much read is because it's so much overkill of maximalism because he will say, here's one way to do it, huge ton of details. Yeah, rub down your legs, have a blanket on, da 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 da, the whole bit, right? Straight out of pre-Mahayana practice, and all of that is preserved. But then he'll say, and then here's a whole other way, right? And then there's going to be some people who's going to be like this. You figure it out. You choose. I'm going to lay them all. It's like an encyclopedia, or a medicine cabinet or something. So everything's in there. And as I said, that it's just a matter of disposition. I guess it might work better if I could discipline myself in a more traditional way. But there's not really a hierarchy there. It's just trying to find what works for you. So for me, it's still very much conditioned, but I guess I have, there are sometimes extreme states or unusual states or, when I am off balance or when I am in some kind of a transition or when I'm stuck in some way is when it will force me to attend in that very specific way, right? I mean, or when I'm motivated by, I'm reading something and I'm like, what in the world is going on here? Like, what does he mean? And then I want to try that out. And then maybe I will, have an opportunity to just walk around town or something for the next 2 hours. And then I encounter, whatever happens, that's just the way it works for me. But it's not any less conditioned than going to a monastery and sitting down, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's just idiosyncratic, I think. And that's as it should be. It's the only way it could be, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, it makes sense that there's some things that might be, for individuals where they are in their life, there might be situations and conditions that are more conducive, but there is this thing of that it is accessible however and wherever you are. I think it's a wonderful thing. And then I wanted to get into your how you exercise your practice and what your experiences have been as you've been kind of journeying through it. But I had one more question about something that I was reading in that article that you sent, where it has this the moments have these pouring qualities where the mental pours into the content and of the or maybe the concept, and then those pour into each other, and then those pour back into the mental state, and there's this constant flow of things into itself. And I had this question for myself when I was younger, and I was reading J.D. Salinger's Nine Stories, and there's this short story called Teddy. It's really wonderful. And there's this moment, it's about this like kid who's pretty sagacious for his age, and he was recalling this story of like watching his sister drink milk, and in that moment he saw God pouring God into God, something similar to that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was like, man, I gotta know what that is. Like I need to know what they mean by that. And I feel like what I was reading in the article kind of got a little close to that. I was wondering if you could help my high school self or my younger self understand that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's really key stuff. I mean, um, so first, like on the, yeah, that language of pouring, it's sort of very surprising in that little passage right at the very end of the article, and it's this weird little piece of text that Zhanran Tang Dynasty Tiantai guy quotes as like an oral transmission from Zhiri, from the founder. So it's not actually in any, where that comes from is just he said it was transmitted, right? And that language of pouring is quite unusual, right? It's specific to this practice of mind contemplation. And as you say, yeah, it's the mind pours into the object pours into the mind, each moment pours into the other moment. And of course, behind that is this whole kind of doctrinal apparatus in Tiantai. Right at the beginning of that article, I slightly paraphrase, but basically quote, one way they say that in Tiantai, that which is very pertinent to what we were just talking about too, which is the Dharma Dhatu, so the absolute, the totality, faces the Dharma Dhatu and gives rise to the Dharma Dhatu. So the absolute faces the absolute, and the result of that encounter is the arisal of the absolute. And they're actually specifically talking there about, old-fashioned Buddhism, which says consciousness arises when it's a three-part thing, right? There's a sense organ, an eye, for example. There's an object, they meet, and then arises consciousness. And that's the very definition of conditionality, right? There's multiple causes give rise to this impermanent event, right? So consciousness in that early Buddhist picture is this sort of spark that comes when a mind hits an object, right? Tiantai says that's exactly right, but each one of those is the entire Dharma Dhatu, the entire universe, the entire totality of all the 3,000 or all things or all dharmas, all Buddhas, right? So it's a very distinctive position because they're not saying, okay, everything is one, it's all suchness, and so really there's no arising. That's one thing you do find in Buddhism in some places, right? Or there's no duality, so there's no this facing that, right? If you're a pure kind of idealist, you would say, well, there's no sense organ and sense object. It's all just mind, or it's all rigpa, or it's all right. This kind of thing, right? So that stuff, if it exists, it's pure epiphenomena, right? But in Tiantai, what they want to say is like each one, considered in and of itself, is the whole. This is what I call omnicentrism. And there's an actual encounter where the whole re-arises every encounter with every moment of consciousness, right? So the moment, that conditional event is the entirety as that conditional event. And the facing, my separation from the object in my life, I turn my head to different objects, right? There's every moment different encounters. But in every case, each one is all three, you might say. So you don't want to like reduce them and say, well, it's all one and the three is an illusion. And you don't want to say they're just three and the one is an illusion. And this language of pouring is one way in the specifically the meditation context where in that particular passage, and I think that one was a real light bulb one for me that like, okay, right, that is a nice, precise, very concrete way of talking about it. And I would say, by the way, so in that case, with mind contemplation, it's specifically about moments of time, right, relating to some past, present, future, and all the elements, the complicated broken teapot and knock on the door that belong to a single moment, and how that relates to things that are outside that moment, and how they have to be both inside and outside, which is the middle, which is the absolute, which is the inclusion of all these conditional states in this intersubsumptive way. I don't want to get too into the weeds, but I wanted to add to that though. I mean, it also, Dogen, you are a Soto Zen practitioner, so you know this is one thing that really interests me, and I often teach Dogen in this way. This is sometimes Orthodox Soto Zen maybe prefers not to think of it this way, but Dogen trained as a Tendai monk before he went to China. And of course, does hugely innovative things with Chan materials, Zen materials, and with Tendai materials, and with the Lotus Sutra. But if you read Uji, Time Being, right, or you read Genjo Koan, actualizing the fundamental point, or Life and Death, or some of those key fascicles in the Shobogenzo, this notion of time pouring into time in all directions, it's actually right there in his own distinct way in Uji, in Time Being, right? When he says, today goes out to meet yesterday, or I think he might even use pouring language in that passage. Today pours into tomorrow, tomorrow pours into yesterday, yesterday pours into today, and then the great Dogen twist, today pours into today, right? But you see that mirrors that same kind of structure, right? It is divided against itself, right? And yet each one of them includes all the others, right? So of course that's all fun in theory, but the great thing about the mind contemplation, and that's why that whole last long section of that article was added like 10 years later, because again I'm like struggling to find I have my own little mini breakthroughs where it's like, oh, I get this, but now how is there a way to explain this step by step? I think so, maybe. Let me try. So that was really like an attempt to you know um, lay out in some detail what I thought was going on there, to unpack that, right? And there it's similarly in terms of moments and these very, the relations of all the complex diversity that's in a moment and yet unified as that moment, and its relation to everything it excludes, as you were saying before, which are not esoteric philosophical points at all, is kind of the point, right? Is that you just have to pay attention, and this is actually what it means to exist in time at all, you know, to pass from one moment to another. I mean, the most basic way for me to experience my present is to experience presently my having not being in the past, which means I can't either isolate the present from the past or identify the present from the past, right? It can't be external to it or internal to it. And that sounds, whoa, weird, mind-blowing. But actually, if you're just going through time in your day, I mean, that's just a question of attending to that, noticing that. And that's what I think those techniques and sort of tweaks are meant to help us do.
Yeah, and I was just wondering, just with this, while you were speaking, I with especially with that, like the inclusion of of what's excluded, in the fullness of the moment, and all the different parts, all kind of corresponding with each other and actualizing as a whole together, all of them being the whole together.
Yeah,
Um, I was wondering if there's some correlation to what I'm presenting, which is like a movie screen. If you're in a movie theater, I forget what the actual statistic is, but you're watching the projected light onto the screen, and for, like, let's say it's an hour and a half movie. I'm making this up, but like there is a certain amount of time, minutes even, that you are in darkness when you're there, but
yeah,
you don't perceive it because the flashing rate
yeah, yeah, right.
onto the thing is there. So there is this kind of component to, maybe at least for the movie, the watching of the movie, you are experiencing both what is included and excluded, because there is this play of light and darkness that's
Oh, yeah.
constantly happening at the same time, but it's imperceptible.
Right, right. You wouldn't be experiencing the presence if it weren't also being negated,
Right.
right? That's
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's a great example in a way, right? Because for something to be there's another thing they do there, which is that arising, abiding, and perishing are simultaneous. I mean, that's a temporal way specific to meditation to say, the establishment of something and its negation or its disappearance are coterminous. They're co-present, right? And you really, to be established is to be negated or this is the meaning of impermanence, right? Which drawn out leads to this new sort of idea of what permanence would mean. It can't be the exclusion of impermanence, right? So yeah, just to be present as a moment in time, you have to pass through that. It's like strumming a guitar, right? You have to move through. But if you're moving through, of course, it's dividing the arising and the perishing, right? And then they're not coterminous. And so, but they have to be for it to be an event that is not the previous event or the next event, right? So it is, you could say it's logically impossible. That's sort of the emptiness critique, but it's going on all the time, right? And the problem is just sort of separating out something being present and something being gone. They're not two different things. The thing is only present by being gone. And in Tiantai, you want to take that the other way. It's gone by being present, you know? I mean, it being gone is another form of its presence, is another way to say that, you know? So, I mean, things that I recognize as gone are present to me as gone, right? I have a fringe of things that, the unknown unknowns that I just say, uh, I know there are a lot of things that are gone. Now, when I go and look closer at that sensation that's intrinsic to my feeling like I'm here rather than there, I mean, that rather involves me right now, right? It's like clicking on a link, right? I see all the other stuff that's in there as I continue to swim into it. But you know, there's no dichotomy between being present and being absent, right? That is sort of the point. That's right. And so even to accomplish presence, it has to be kind of saturated with its own absence. It doesn't happen unless it's disappearing, is another way to put it,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, wow.
Nothing
Well,
that isn't disappearing can be experienced, can be present, right? That's
yeah.
basic impermanence, right?
Wow. And well, thank you for helping me kind of there's plenty more for me to kind of sit with and understand. So thank you for sharing this. And I was wondering too, because like you're drawn to this. You're drawn to really thoroughly plumbing this and investigating these Tiantai meditative texts and just applying it in your life. And I was just wondering, like, from your position in practice, because there are some other traditions, maybe not Zen, because like Zen kind of as we talked about, like, might not instruct in this way because they want some sort of other experience to kind of arise. But when was there something that drew your attention specifically towards Tiantai versus maybe something that has other thorough systems, like I know it's like Tibetan Buddhism has a lot of like
Yeah,
visualizations and things like that.
yeah. Great question. I mean, actually, I was initially, as the title of that book would suggest, and some of my other publications. I mean, I was first made familiar with Buddhism through Zen, and became familiar with Zen because I had a prior interest in Taoism. So I had an interest in these traditions within the Chinese cultural sphere, and we probably don't have time to go into biographically why that is, but it started that way, and I came to know Zen literature in English a little bit before I started learning Chinese. And I mean, part of the motivation, much of the motivation for that was to learn to read those texts. I really wanted to try to understand. I mean, so yeah, on some very visceral level, I was very, very moved and galvanized by A, the Laozi and the Zhuangzi, but B, really like late period koan literature in particular. And it was such a unique, so different from everything, but the thing that got through to me in a different way than any other kind of writing I knew, and yet it was so impenetrable in some ways that I did feel like I needed to maybe learn that language. So I was interested in that trajectory, that there was something going on in the way Buddhism was moving in this Chinese cultural sphere, and then of course I started to learn more, and I started to be a little more competent in the language. And I was in Taiwan after college for a couple of years, learning, basically just doing this stuff. And it was then that I was sort of able to identify what it was that had attracted me so much, both in Zen, in koan literature in particular, and in the early Taoist texts, and it had to do with the way paradox or contradiction is treated. So, this is a big theme, the theme of reversal or things reversing when they reach an extreme, or, it comes forth in a milder form in sort of yin yang thinking. But this was a thing you definitely got a kind of relishing of paradox and of contradiction, not as a problem to be solved, but as the solution to the problem in some way, as existentially hugely important. This had some kind of resonance with me intuitively. It took me a long time to try to figure out exactly why that would be, but that was the thread that joined those things, and it was from there, and of course the Mahayana Sutras, right? After that, much later, right after I knew Taoism a little bit, and I knew Zen literature a little bit. One of the things I did in Taiwan was I was then sort of able with a teacher to read Mahayana Sutras in the Chinese canon, right? And there too, of course, there's this very strong element of paradox. Samsara is nirvana, right? Kleshas are bodhi, or things like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Vimalakirti Sutra, right? Relishes in these kind of paradoxical formulations. And it was through that I got deeper into Mahayana Buddhism more generally, right? In particular, value paradox, this paradox of apparently positive and apparently negative states, samsara and nirvana being the extreme examples, right? How can these two, the most opposite opposites in terms of their existential meaning for us, the worst thing and the best thing, as it were, be identical? And of course, Zen Chan in China has had its own way of interpreting that, and every school in the Mahayana does, because it's in the scriptures, and it's in Nagarjuna, it's in Madhyamaka, right? So, and two truths is one way to do it. There's various ways to do it. What really pulled me into Tiantai, though, was it was there that I found the most sort of thoroughgoing, systematic focus on that very question. That was the thing they define themselves by. They delineate different ways to interpret samsara as nirvana. Like, you can interpret it just to mean everything is empty, they're the same in that they're empty. That's you have the classification of teachings in Tiantai, and there's, okay, that's one meaning of identical. But then there's this even more identical, right? And then there's yet another even more identical. So that's what really, because that was the problem I had. That was the thing that fascinated me and was existentially relevant to me in the deepest way. And I mean, the sutras don't actually explain, right? That's not their job. They're not trying to do that. They're hitting you with that paradox. And then and the koans also don't explain, right? Of course, you're supposed to practice with it in a different way. And Taoist texts never explain anything, right? So, but Tiantai does, right? They take all these tools they get from Indian logic, from emptiness critique, from their sort of hermeneutic system that they develop, and you really get this very thoroughgoing, deep dive into that stuff, and then a meditative practice that's totally geared around that, right? So that was the thing. And I mean, of course, once you start drilling into a thing like that, it's like you sort of get stuck. You can't get out. I always quote, there's a great Chinese proverb, "Qi hu nan xia," when you're riding a tiger, it's hard to get off. You know?
Yeah. And I suppose that there are a lot of different ways of interpreting that too, because like there's like a joy and there's like a speed and adventure, but there's also this thing of like, well, what if the tiger's hungry?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
or like whatever it
Exactly.
is.
You just got to keep with it once you're in this deep, right?
Yeah. And I fully appreciate the that draw, because like I think what brought me into Zen was like this koan thing, because I come from I have an entertainment background, and I love comedy, and so like
Mm.
there's this uh ridiculousness, or like this
Yes.
joke quality to these koans. It's like someone will say something, it's like, what is, I'm making this up, like, what is Buddha nature, and then one of the teachers will like put a shoe on their head and then walk out, and you're like, okay, well, there's something there, there's something obscure and funny
Yeah.
about this, but what is it? And
Totally.
and so, but what you're saying too is just like the embrace of the paradox, and the paradox being a possible solution to the paradox, and then having these kind of systems that kind of acknowledge that like it really is applicable to living life in this world though, right? Because there's some real highs and some real lows about this experience, and so I appreciate that as an entryway for you to delve deep, and so have you been to some of these like to Mount Hiei, and have you been to some of these places
I
to
have not.
connect?
On here, I have not. I've been in Japan, in Kyoto, so more of the. I haven't been to Dogen's main temple. I would like to go,
Mm-mm-mm.
but I've been to some practice. I mean, Nara, I've been to. I don't know. Have you been to
No, no,
Japan?
no, no. I've been to Japan, but not these places. No.
Oh yeah. I mean, Nara was incredible. It was one of those places very, but that's famously where the deer are there and are wandering the streets and bowing to you and everything. But a lot of these really beautifully preserved, Heian period or slightly later temples, and really weird, interesting ones, because like there are temples of the Hosho sect, which is the consciousness only Yogacara. They have like a beautifully carved statue of Asanga and Vasubandhu, these great Buddhist philosophers. That's incredible to see. You know, Mount Hiei I have not. I have been to Mount Tiantai in China, where Zhi taught and Guoqin is there, and up on the top of that mountain, it's been a long time since I've been there, but I've sent students over there since. Um, but on the top of that mountain, they even back then was in the 90s when I was last there, and they had this sort of little Tentai Institute at the very top of this Wanyan was the temple there, and I've been told by students who've been there since, still flourishing there. So yeah, that was a big thrill for me, and Ningbo where Dogen actually landed, right, in China, and there's a big temple there with a lot of Soto groups come from Japan and set up steels and up there, and a lot of those places in Zhejiang area. Yeah, spent time.
Well, I just have one more conversational question before I get into two smaller questions. But if it's okay if I asked you just one more thing, which is that because I know that you have an experience with Tiantai that's a part of your practice, and you also have an engagement with a Soto Zen lineage there in Chicago. I was wondering, like, when you go and you sit and when you sit zazen, do you put some of this meditative Tiantai meditative instruction down to then do the Zen, or do you find that sometimes there's this little
Yeah,
conversation that you have with yourself?
both, and I mean that goes for the year I was really doing sitting meditation during COVID. I did do a shikantaza thing, and I because I as I said heretically I view that as a kind of alt version of Tendai. So and that's a longer conversation, right? I don't want to really raise anybody's hackles or anything, but it may doing shikantaza according to the way that Dogen instructs. He has a couple short instruction texts, of course, and he says a lot. Bendowa is a great text for how he thinks about meditation, which work really, they can kind of feed into each other, and I kind of trade off. I could be really specific if you want me to. I mean, there's the go-to ones I would normally, and I would do a Theravada practice. I would do a Anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, which has like a 16-step rubric. And in those days, when I'm doing that, I really like to do that and try to do it all the way. But one of the great things about the Tiantai system is every Tiantai thing applies to all those old practices too. They never throw anything out. They're sort of the pack rats of Buddhism in some way. So every one of those practices they'll give, and then they'll give you a different context where it means this whole other thing. And one of my favorite meditation texts from Jiri is a thing called the Liu Miao Fan, and it means it's translated in English. In fact, I may use it in class this quarter. The six Dharma gates to the sublime. That's how they translate it. And it's a beautiful example of this because it's like in 10 parts and it's just mindfulness of breathing, really, you know. He has another text called The Four Foundations of Mindfulness, which is just that, right? The old school Four Foundations of Mindfulness. Let me start with that one. That's in 4 parts, and the first part is you could get it out of any Theravada, meditation teacher. Mindfulness of the body and all those familiar steps, and mindfulness of mental formations, and mindfulness of mind, mindfulness of dharmas. And the second one goes through the whole thing again, but now from the perspective of what they call the shared teaching. This is their classification. And then the third volume, third gen, fascicle, is the whole thing from the separate teaching. So the content is the same, right? And then they do the fourth one from the perfectly integrated teaching, all this full-on Tentai stuff. So you're just recontextualizing, kind of expanding the implications, but the practice is exactly the same. You're going through the same steps, and it's so you mindfulness of body, mindfulness of or mindfulness of breath. The other one, the 6 Dharma Gates text, does that with mindfulness of breath, and it has these 6 little categories that come out of, it's not technically Theravada, but pre-Mahayana materials. And then he does that same thing. It's 10 chapters, and the second chapter now, okay, that was a sequence. Now you can do them in any order. For example, he scrambles them. You can start at 5 and go to 2, and then 4, and then, okay? And then these things purely in terms of bodhisattva practice. And then how each one of them actually includes the other 5. There's a way to do it that way, okay? And then, as mind only, and then doing them as this intersubsumptive kind of Tentai full-on thing, right? So, you don't have to be thinking about that every time, but you can, I like to do, if I am in that, doing sort of formal practice like that, as I say, few and far between, but when I do, and when I did that daily for that period of time, yeah, I would be mindful. The 4 foundations was one that I often used. Mindfulness of breathing, shikantaza, 6 Dharma gates, and sometimes if I really was feeling ambitious or I was really getting into some close to samadhi, I would try the Mohajjhagwan hardcore, straight up Tiantai stuff. But that was, it can all be Tiantaiified, but you can always start out without doing that, and that's a great way to get ready to do that. So
That's amazing. You've I'm really admiring the breadth of what you can pull from. Like you have this amazing like tool shed or resource library, more so, that you can kind of just pull from and see like what can help you meet that moment when,
yeah,
and it's a really wonderful use that you had during that lockdown, where you were like, well, this is the time that I can apply these things, and the fact that you took advantage of it is in this way is just really wonderful, and it's just really great to hear how flexible you are with how what you can incorporate. This is fantastic, and so I just had two quicker questions. One is if you had anything that you'd like to promote, because I know you're author of several books, and I'd like to offer some of those now. There are some of the more recent ones are your Emptiness and Omnipresence, an essential introduction to Tiantai Buddhism. You've done a translation of Zhuangzi, the complete writings. You have a new translation of the Tao Te Ching, and one of your latest works is Experiments in Mystical Atheism, Godless Epiphanies from Daoism to Spinoza and Beyond. You also can, there's a resource for finding more of your work at voices.uchicago.edu/Ziporyn. And yeah, I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to offer.
um, I mean, I can just say a word or two about those texts. Thank you for mentioning them. I mean, the that book, Emptiness and Omnipresence, is the sort of attempt to you know talk about Tiantai ideas, some of the Lotus Sutra and its interpretation, in as close as I could to sort of very accessible, non-technical language. So I found people who are interested in Tentai, that one tends to be more well liked. It's really based on classroom lectures, more technical stuff where I'm actually translating and quoting a lot of Tentai material, you'd have to go back further. So, and that stuff's not so easily available. This last book, this Mystical Atheism book, is the it has online appendices which deal with Buddhism, but and the original version of it was very intermixed with Taoism and Buddhism and these Western philosophical figures like Spinoza, Nietzsche, George Bataille, uh, and then also in another way more Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus, people like that through the tradition. So it's more of a philosophical work of that kind, but actually, in the appendices which are online, uh, there's a very long section on Buddhism, about Confucianism and about Buddhism, lots of different parts of Buddhism. Not Shikantaza actually, though there is a section. I may have put part of that in there, but I mean that's another thing I'd like to write on in this context. But some on Pure Land Buddhism and other things, Bodhisattva practice, things like that. It's all on the online part. People can get that for free. So this is what I want to say, that like if you're not interested in the Western philosophical part of this, Spinoza, really down the rabbit hole stuff, inside baseball, Spinoza stuff, but if you're interested in just the Buddhism stuff, and Confucianism is in there too, you're very welcome to just go and get that. If you want, I can give you the link and you can just post that. So
Oh,
that'll
that'd be
be,
great. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, that
yeah.
in the description. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so it's a kind of a different kind of work, but the Buddhism part is there. It's between the lines in the main texts, but it's explicit in the online stuff.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you for making that a resource that's accessible to everybody too. That's a really wonderful thing that you provide there. And also, I just wanted to ask. This is a more advice-based question, but do you have any advice for somebody who is walking the Buddhist path that you would have wanted to have heard as you were beginning your journey into it?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Um, yeah, I mean, again, this goes back to the sort of dispositional thing. So I think there are people who it's great, you know, the sort of community, the Sangha aspect is very important. And if that's the case for you, I mean, it really does help. And it was one thing I was going to say about the going to the Soto, the Ancient Dragon Center. Like when I do go there, I always really like that, right? I mean, I will tend to try to do more shikantaza with them, just as part of that group, and that's really cool and unusual for me. But it wouldn't be probably how things would have worked for me as a younger person. It's just a personality thing. So I would just say, try out different things. There's so much going on in Buddhism. I mean, there's so many dimensions of it, and unfortunately, some of it we're still, in terms of language, there's an awful lot of material that you can't yet access in English. So that's a limitation if you're restricted to English, but there's still so much already in English, right? That there's much you can do. So I would say poke around. There's so many different traditions and sub traditions. If you have that impulse, it might be for you to join a sangha, and there's different sanghas, and they have different styles, and they have different kind of ways of doing things, different vibes. Or if you're the kind of person, which is probably how I mainly was, I mean, you may just want to go your own way, but I mean, I always liked meeting and hanging out with, talking to, the kind of institutional Buddhist people, and I did a fair amount of that, but I never would join, I was too skittish to do that, but it's another way to go, and no shame in it, you know what I mean? It's like, sorry, you're frozen there for a second. Um, uh, Either way, if you're text bound, don't worry about that. If you're a cerebral person, do it that way, and if you're an emotional person, do it that way. They'll all come together as you proceed, I think, right? And if you're like a group activity person or a loner, either way, they will join. You just start where you are, and I don't think you need to force yourself. That's one thing I really appreciate about the Tiantai texts, as I said, right? This is because they're early on and they're before these institutional pressures are around. So it's rare in later text to see it, but Jury will just come out and say, see which works for you. See where you can enter. And if you try this and you can't enter, is his word, try this other one, There's
Yeah.
something has to catch, something has to click. And there's so many resources, 84,000 types of sentient beings, right? A million different upayas. You have to sniff around till something grabs you.
Certainly. Well, Brooke, thank you so much for speaking with me today. This is such a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate you ending it, especially on that note where it's about you know honing that practice. Like it's more or less just about like someone making the decision to practice, and then however you wish to express that, however you wish to kind of have the rubber meet the road on that, whether it's in community or if it's your nightstand Buddhist, or if you're just kind of feeling it more emotively in a solo way. That can all be ways for you to express that. And thank you so much for sharing so much about your story. It's been a wonderful thing to hear about, and yeah, and thank you for sharing everything that you've done as a scholar as well.
It's been my pleasure. It's really a fun conversation. I rarely get to talk about this stuff in particular. It's really fun for me. Thank you for having me.